UNDRIP. Let's start again. Hey, um, hmm. So what is the UNDRIP? So I started off by explaining that it's an instrument of international law, and yeah, essentially, international law is a scam, and international law doesn't actually technically apply to anyone because it's like, yeah, like it's not binding usually. And even if it is, people go to the ICJ and are like, "Yo, let's let's enforce stuff," and then they don't. And and it's like, damn, why does international law even exist then? When literally it does not matter. But yeah, so this declaration is meant to be enshrining the rights of Indigenous peoples. And yeah, I'm not gonna make an evaluation just yet because that's later. But essentially, uh, it's meant to be this big ass document in international law that says, hey, Indigenous people have rights too, and they should be protected. And it was passed in 2007, which may seem quite late, but yeah, uh, it took a while. All right, so what's the history of it? Where did it come from? Essentially, there was an Indigenous draft declaration um, that eventually made its way into um, the final UN draft declaration. So there's like one that was drafted up in Geneva, and then one that was modified and ratified in New York. Some people have issues with the final wording of the UNDRIP. Um, yeah, I do as well. And there are some smart people that agree with me. But yeah, it was essentially it arose from a UN working group on Indigenous people. So I'm not gonna turn it into like an abbreviation thing. UNDRIP is enough. Um, but yeah, there was a working group, and essentially doesn't exist anymore. It was replaced as a result of the passage of the UNDRIP. Um, Lots of debate and discourse happened from about the mid 90s up until 2006 when it was initially scheduled to, be debated on and passed. But obviously it didn't pass in 2006, otherwise I would have said that it did, because some African nations decided that they weren't quite happy with the wording, and they were like, yo, can we have a bit extra time? Still pass it in the 61st session, but yeah. So that happened, and then it got passed. What do people think of it though? Is it good or bad? Depends who you ask. Um, I have very many thoughts on Article 46 of the draft declaration, or not the draft, the UNDRIP, right? Article 46 bad, in my opinion. Um, I personally think it just undoes any good that the draft. Oh, fuck, why am I calling it a draft? The final declaration could do. Some people disagree with that, but yeah. Um, what do other people think? There are some people that agree with me that the declaration is ineffective and bad, but there are some Aboriginal Australian scholars that would say that you can actually take some good out of it, which, eh, I mean, they know better than me. They do be Indigenous peoples, um, and I'll go through like how they can see it working. But first, let's go through some criticisms. Alright. So first, why I think it sucks. Essentially, Article 46, Section 1. What does that say? So let's read out the full text together. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations or construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Mouthful. What does that mean, though? So let's take it apart. So the Declaration essentially says you can't interpret it in a way that a state, a people, or a group, or even an individual person are allowed to engage in any activity that's contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, or any activity that would dismember or impair, that is, I guess, affect the territorial integrity, so the borders, the lands that a nation state, is in charge of, or the political unity of a sovereign independent state. So political unity is, I think, well, okay. There's two bits here that I think are very blatantly shit. let's just put it like that. They're blatantly shit. So territorial integrity. What does that mean? Well, if we're not dismembering or impairing the territorial integrity, that means we're not, affecting a nation state's, sovereign independence, so a nation state. We're not affecting the ability of a nation state to, do its thing, being a state and all. So that's not good, because indigenous peoples tend to, occupy lands that are resource rich. For example, Australia. Rio Tinto blowing up an indigenous site. Hello. Like, essentially, this charter gives an out for people to basically say, hey, we're not going to let you protest against that because you're affecting our territorial integrity, which sucks, because why should, let's say, the Australian government dictate and say, okay, Rio Tinto has more of a claim to this area than the people that have literally been there for like thousands of years and have a connection to that land. Why? The fact that this document has such an out in it is not good. Second part that's really not good, just in Article 46, there's other bits that we'll get to later that are bad. So, political unity. Political unity is another very dangerous thing. Because it's like, it just sucks. Because you can claim that anyone protesting is violating your political unity. Why? Like, there's a literal example of this happening, actually. So, technically speaking, the Nubians that live, mostly in southern Egypt, but in other parts of Egypt as well, they could claim to be indigenous. However, the national government of Egypt would, go at them for, taking in international ideas instead of being, Arab nationalist, and they would call them out for disturbing political unity, and so they don't use the language of indigeneity because it would be dangerous for them, right? Like, they don't want to get even worse conditions than they already have. So, at its extreme, this this article could justify detaining protesters just because they're protesting to have access to their own lands. Like, shit article. And funnily enough, this got added after the initial draft. Yeah. Alright. It's, in my opinion, it just undoes the entire, like, legal weight of the Declaration. And it just goes to show that the UN has zero drip. Alright. So, why do other people think it sucks? So, I'll be drawing here on a 2012 paper by Watson and Venn. And essentially, they have a lot to say as well. Their main contention is that the original draft from Geneva, that was actually like written in part by a UN researcher that he basically commissioned a paper and he like did the research and stuff that said, hey, Indigenous people don't have social equity. Let's fix that. So he helped draft the Geneva draft, as it's called, before it got sent off to New York for the final, once over and any edits that need to be made. And there were a lot of edits that maybe didn't need to be made, but were made anyway. So yeah. Watson and Venn are very adamant that the Geneva version had a much better set of wording. So the first issue they point to in the UNDRIP as it exists is that it's very broad. Oh well. It's very broad in defining who is and isn't indigenous, right? It calls back to, oh, people that have been affected by the historical effects of colonialism, right? That's true, but is it necessarily useful? Watson and Venn don't think so. The original draft, the Geneva draft, was more specific about that, right? It was way more specific. But yeah. The next point of contention that Watson and Venn have is that, oops, the UNDRIP kind of justifies the stolen generation. So for the Americans in the chat, stolen generation was essentially the Australian government deciding that they knew better how to raise Aboriginal kids, and they took them from their parents and tried to assimilate them into white culture. Fucking awful. The UNDRIP, it it sucks with this, right? It essentially says that recognizing in particular the right of Indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibility for the upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children, consistent with the rights of the child. That's dangerous because the rights of the child, that's like the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's a UN document, and that essentially says that there's some, rules that you kind of have to respect when you're dealing with children, right? And some things may be construed as, endangering the child or not to the child's benefit, and implies that the nation state, the colonial state, might know better than the indigenous parents, which, again, it kinda leans towards justifying shit like the stolen generation. Fun aside related to that, when the Declaration was passed, there were 4 nations that voted against it. They later changed their mind when they realized that the Declaration wasn't that much of a threat, because it's just a UN declaration. Want to know what those 4 nations were? Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. I wonder what those 4 have in common. Could it be a history of mistreatment of Indigenous people in their current lands? Could that be it? Could that be what they have in common? Anyway, as I said, they later they turned around, did a 180. They actually did say that they agree with it later. Does that undo all that they did? No. The fact that they even opposed it to begin with, they could have abstained. Like fucking Russia abstained, and Russia has its own fair share of colonialism in Central Asia and Siberia. But they had the balls to abstain and not outright oppose it, right? They had tact. And I hate that I'm saying that about Russia, but yeah. So yeah, Kansas partnership bad. What else? So another issue that Watson and Venn have with the UNDRIP is that it neuters the language in the original draft about genocide and makes it very weird. It takes references to the UN Charter and all that and just kind of pushes it to the side and in some ways duplicates what the UN Charter already says. And is like, oh, but it applies differently to Indigenous people. Kind of shitty. Another related point is that references to the UN Charter would also strengthen, affirmation of self-determination. Later on, I will cover someone who disagrees with that, but Watson and Venn think that removing references to the UN Charter doesn't help. It goes against helping. And there's another fun point for anyone that might be interested in language. So essentially, the UNDRIP as it exists just says that Indigenous peoples should be allowed to and helped in maintaining their language and culture and all that. Original draft, the Geneva draft, it said that there should be revitalization efforts, right? Like language maintenance when you've got barely people speaking it. It's not super effective. Like, you need revitalization efforts. You need to help more people speak the language to keep it living, to keep it from being a note in a book that says, oh, in Australia there were over 250 languages spoken and now there's 100 or whatever. Actually, it's probably more like 50. Point is, you don't want that to happen. And ignoring the fact that revitalization needs to happen is, in a way, helping that, which is not good. Another not good thing is connection to land. So essentially, the original draft said that Indigenous peoples should be afforded the right to, continue enjoying their lands that they have a connection to, right? The UNDRIP kind of it reduces it down to cultural artifacts, and specifically, Venn and Watson are like, this is the museumification of indigeneity, which is a fun way of looking at it. Well, not really fun. It's an interesting way of putting it though, because essentially they think that there's too much, whiteness in this UNDRIP. Well, you could specifically point to it being Britishness, where it's like it just ignores the fact that Indigenous peoples have a living connection to their land. And, well, not their, like, the land. Because, yeah, like, not everyone has the same Western nation-state definition of owning lands. Yeah, so, like, the connection to the land is something that the UNDRIP doesn't really address properly. Well, according to Watson and Venn. The other thing that I touched on earlier that Watson and Venn take issue with is the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples being abolished. And it was abolished and replaced with something else. What was that something else? The Indigenous Expert Mechanism. So what does that do? Nothing. Nothing's what it does. Essentially, they take every second year, they pick a topic, so like education or women's rights or some whatever, and every other year they take on like, oh, how did our previous initiatives go? It kind of prevents Indigenous people coming in and being like, hey, there is shit going down for me and my people in so and so country. Please, like, address that. It removes that as an option. And in fact, at one of the expert mechanism like meetings, an Indigenous woman was kind of shut down. She was like talking about genocide happening, and the UN was like, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but actually, you aren't talking about education, so I'm gonna have to ask you to step back." And I don't think I have to explain why that's bad. Like, removing something that kind of worked and replacing it with ineffective shit, not good. um, yeah, and I mean, I don't have to explain why it's not good, but there is some good here. There is, uh, well, if we're making this an essay, this is the contrary paragraph. So this is mostly based on Davis 2016. However, it's like a transcript of a talk that she did in 2013. Anyway, point is, she thinks that there is some good in it, and it boils down to communities are cool. Well, not just that, but she sees self-determination not as broadly as Venn and Watson do. She sees it purely as the community having control of issues that directly affect it, right? So it's she thinks that the UNDRIP works as a mechanism to enable that. So the UNDRIP essentially talks of Indigenous people being in a partnership with their, their government that they exist under. However, it doesn't necessarily fill in the blanks on what kind of relationship that should be. It also doesn't really fill in the blanks on, remedies. It's just kind of like, yeah, do stuff, woo. Not very helpful. But Davis thinks that by looking at models of what has worked in Australia, considering that there was Australian involvement in the UNDRIP, even if our government is a piece of shit that, you know, voted against it in the end. But yeah, no, like, Indigenous Australians did contribute to the UNDRIP, even if there may be some flaws with it, which some people think there are flaws with it. It's not like a universal opinion, which is why I'm talking about this. But yeah, so Davis talks about regional governance and how well that's worked. So she specifically points to the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority and their partnership agreement and that's a people that are in the Lower Murray River region in South Australia. If you're Australian and you want to know. So essentially, what they do is they take charge of community initiatives. There's like Aboriginal allied health stuff that they're like a part of, and they are kind of in charge of medical stuff, like the governance of it at least. And at least at a regional level, they have control over the traditional lands that they were the custodians of, right? Yeah. So a phrase that Davis keeps using in her speech is putting meat on the bones, and in fact, the title is "Putting Meat on the Bones of the UNDRIP," right? And she believes that Indigenous people should take the lead on actually implementing the UNDRIP and don't rely on colonial governments to kind of be like, all right, we're going to implement the UNDRIP as a law, which they haven't. They haven't implemented it as a law. Fun fact: Australia doesn't even have a Bill of Rights for all citizens. Yeah, that's a can of worms, though. I'm sure there are people in the chat who would have thoughts about bills of rights, but that's okay. But yes, Davis thinks they should take the lead. Other authors and myself may think that actually we should be trying to force colonial governments to secede their or to stop their bullshit, and actually give control. But that's not gonna happen anytime soon. And it's unfortunate. Like it's people are too worried about, making a war with China than actually treating the people in their country with the respect they deserve and helping to right wrongs against them from the past. Well, not even just from the past, like still existing wrongs. And like lastly, Davis is like, yo, the colonial government should be the junior partner. Like they should be implementing laws on the advice of regional community authorities, which dare I call it idealistic? I think it's a little idealistic. I I think that there is good work being done on a regional level, but nationally, as long as there is a certain fella down under in charge and his party in charge, nothing's gonna happen. Like they have a lot of incentive to do nothing and keep giving money to their rich donors. So, yeah, it is a little wishful, a little idealistic, but I dig it, kinda. I think it's a good perspective on, well, the UNDRIP isn't all bad, right? Like there are some good aspects. So yeah, what did we learn today? We learned that the UNDRIP has no drip. But yeah, no, that it's a complex document, and that uh, it really it has good and bad to it. I personally think there's more bad than good in it because colorized, yes. Can we get a pog in the chat for knowledge? um, yeah. But it's like there's there's some good there that I think is overshadowed by the fact that it basically undoes itself. It says, here are some rights that apparently people have, but also nation states get to decide that no, actually, we're not going to give you rights, and if you protest against us not giving you rights, bye-bye, right? Like, I guess in nations that are more in the international spotlight, like Australia, it can be more helpful, but yeah, it's not a given. So the other fun thing that I hope we've learned today is that international law is a massive fucking spook. It's not real, and the fact that we're even debating international law is kind of silly because it relies on nations to implement it and abide by it, and they don't. Like, again, the Nubians in Egypt realistically should be considered indigenous, but the Arab nationalist Egyptian government is a piece of shit. I'm on record saying that, yes. But it's like this document essentially says, yes. Stood a moment. Yeah. No, like it's they just decide to not like respect it, and you can't really do anything about it. Like the US isn't gonna go world police on an issue that it itself is, shitty on. And like what benefit would it have? So yeah, it's not gonna be enforced. Um what else? What else do we have? Um yeah, brief summary. So meant to enshrine right of Indigenous peoples, came from a history of colonialism, which is bad. Colonialism bad. Um there are parts that I think suck and other people think suck, but some people are taking advantage of it to, improve their own material conditions and try and have their rights respected. Well, oh, I mean, rights. What is a right? A right is very, very complicated, and essentially, it ceases to be super important once you get out of the West, because only the West really is strongly about those rights, because they arose like in the 18th century with like liberalism and all that shit. Yeah. Oh, here's a fun hot take that I'm gonna leave you all with. Liberalism bad. So yeah, it's the UNDRIP document that's good and bad. And here's my citations. I'll put them in the description when I upload this to YouTube as well. In case you want to, read what I read. I mean, obviously, if I like had a bibliography of everything that I read overall to get an idea of this, subject, it'd be pages long. But no, this is just the main stuff that went into this specific stream. So yeah, I hope that was interesting and hope I used the right stream like category. Yeah. Thanks all for watching. As I mentioned, the last educational stream. I'm not gonna do these more than once a week, so my next stream will probably be a gaming stream. Maybe this weekend, we'll see. You can follow me on Twitter if you wanna be notified of whenever I'm streaming next. Or whatever random thoughts pop into my head. That's also a fun way to get that experience. Watch my shorts and follow me on Twitter. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you all at some point in the future. Bye-bye.